As I said a few minutes ago, I'm Andy Boynton, and I'm the Dean of the Carroll School of Management. And I just want to introduce this session to everybody. Thank everybody for joining us, taking time out of your busy schedules, wherever you are. And welcome to the second series of our kind of forum, inclusive leadership in terms of racial equity and so forth. What I wanted to do is just talk about a few things going on campus. There's a lot happening at BC around this right now. Yesterday, I spent an hour on a session out on the lawn, BC Solidarity event around racial justice. And we had some speakers, and then we worked in small groups, socially distanced, discussing the issues that BC faces. And in the group, there were graduate students, undergraduates, administrators, and professors. And it was really a motivating, stimulating hour. Now, that hour is not going to change the world, but that was one drop amongst many drops in a bucket going on at BC of events and conversations around this issue of racial justice and solidarity and so forth. And so it's for me, it was stimulating and motivating, and it made me look forward to today even more. The last time we met, Carroll led us through a great session with Dewin, and Marilyn Eckelman was involved and so forth. And there's some things I learned from the last sessions. I'm just going to go through them briefly. And it doesn't mean you learned them and maybe you weren't able to join us, but one point, and I'm not going to expand on all these, is that diversity is good for business. But for me, diversity is good for education. And it's good for learning. And I actually didn't think I'd say this, but this book, The Idea Hunter, is a book I wrote. And the reason I mention it in the book is it's IDEA, idea. And the second point is around diversity. You want a diversity of idea sources. You want different people, different backgrounds, different knowledge domains to be part of your idea network. And that is about racial diversity as well. And it's good for education, it's good for business, it's good for us as citizens to create that kind of network around us. That's one learning. Another was that, similar to a message in the book, an inclusive environment engages outliers. And I never would know where I'm going to go when I talk exactly, but I'm a professor. And for those who are really interested, there's a fantastic sociologist who was at MIT. His name was Mark Granovetter. And I don't know when he was there, I think early 70s. And he wrote about a theory, it's in my book, it's well known, called strength of weak ties. Strength of weak ties. And it's a famous article. And his point, and it's been mathematically shown in many situations, is that the best ideas, the most innovative insights come from weak tie networks. People who you don't usually are engaged with. And he looks at industries that learn things from very remote industries, people that learn things from very remote disciplines. And so that this notion of diversity, of creating a weak ties of all sorts of people will in fact fuel better ideas, more innovation. So this isn't just like do it because it's right. It is right. I think it's an aspiration this country's founded on and has failed at, but we can only try to do better. But it is right, but it also makes us smarter. This outlier concept, connecting with people that aren't, who are in our social network. Look up Granovetter's work. Diversity doesn't just happen by itself, it requires constant, deliberate process. I believe that about everything. If you want to get something done, you got to manage the heck out of it. And you got to follow up, and you got to create a process. You can't just think of it now and then. It's true with diversity. It's true with great teaching. It's true in companies with great whatever they're trying to do. It's about an energized process that you can scale up, and it's the only way to do it. And finally, I thought Carroll's insights around listen, learn, enact, and change are important. For me, it's personally important. Listen, learn, enact, and change. Because a lot of times, and Marilyn knows this, and people that work with me, I just want to get in and solve the problem and do something. because we too often sit around and talk about stuff, but you do have to listen and learn. And Carroll made that point in a compelling fashion, and then enact and change. So I learned a lot. It gets me to reflect, and I hope it did also for you. Carroll gave us a challenge, a 30-day leadership challenge in the last session, something that we could personally do ourselves. You could do, I could do, everybody could do. And I had a no-brainer. What could I do to create a more diverse environment in the Carroll School? And we're trying to do this. It's difficult to do. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do better. But this one was easy. I invited Carroll to be on my board of advisors for the Carroll School. And she graciously said yes. So she's going to be at my side, probably in more ways than she realizes. We have some other ideas. But she'll be on the board of advisors, which is a group I meet with several times a year. I talk to them on the phone. We meet formally. We talk about the school. I also think Carroll's going to be part of Warren Zola's a fantastic CEO club, which is the leading CEO speaking club in the country. Warren does a great job leading that. And Carroll's going to be part of that, which will bring the school and integrate the school further into the Boston community along diversity lines. And so we're excited about her being more involved in the Carroll School. So that's kind of my views on things, some things, homework, you can go read Mark Granovetter, my personal learnings. I hope you learned some things. And I hope you thought about what your 30-day inclusive challenge was all about. I'm now going to turn it over to Marilyn Eckelman, who's the senior dean for our entire graduate program. Huge MBA, MBA, huge part-time MBA, big masters of finance. Marilyn runs the whole shebang, does a terrific job. And I'm going to turn it over here to Marilyn to keep us going on the forum. Marilyn?
Okay, my apologies. So I'd like to first of all join Andy in welcoming you to today's forum. And the title of it is African American Inequality in the United States and the Impact of Unconscious Bias. And could we think of a more timely topic at this point in our history? The first half of this forum is going to be a discussion with Q&A on the pre-reading, of the article African American Inequality in the US. Please begin to share your comments, questions through the Q&A section, not the chat. If you would please put it through the Q&A section, we will have periods where we'll stop and address your comments. Specifically, what we're looking for and what you might consider is what one word comes to mind when reading or discussing the case study. What didn't you know? As an inclusive leader, what would you do differently now than as a result of reading or listening to the discussion on the case? The second half of the forum will move from history to present day. The forum will focus on how bias, particularly unconscious bias, continues inequities today. Again, please be sure to continue your comments and questions through the Q&A. I would like to welcome back Carroll Fulp, the founder and CEO of Fulp Diversity and an authority on diversity and inclusion. Carroll is the author of Success Through Diversity, Why the Most Inclusive Companies Can Win. And from working with her personally, just an honor to have her be a part of the BC community.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure working with you. And it's so good to be back with Dewin and Justin, and I so value my colleague Warren for introducing me to Andy and to the BC community. I want to acknowledge to you that it was Dean Boynton who suggested our reading today, the African American Inequality in the United States. he read this HBS case study and was really moved by it. And we had a very long discussion about it and wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to share it with the greater Boston College community. And so we base this forum on this discussion, but it is your dean who was moved by this work. And we have a chance now to expand upon this work. So let us begin. I want you to sit and just take some time with me and imagine ourselves 160 years ago in America. Imagine ourselves. So here I am today in my life. 160 years ago, I, as an African American, would not be sitting here. I would be serving you. That's all I had the opportunity to do. And my life would be desolate. And if we were in the South, and if you are white, and even if you're 20, if we were in the South and you're a white person, man or woman, 20 years old, you would own me. I would be your slave forever. That is our history. And we don't talk about that a lot. And that's a large part of our problem, because we cannot solve our challenges unless we really acknowledge our history. So let's acknowledge who we are as a country so that we are able to move on and realize our full potential that we all believe in. Let's acknowledge that this country was formed by Europeans coming over and stealing land from Native Americans and moving them to small parcels of land. Let's acknowledge, through what we've read, certainly, in this amazing case study, that these individuals who inhabited this country went to Africa and took 13 million Africans over 400 years and enslaved them. The largest deportation of human beings in history. Let's acknowledge that. This is horrific. And so we don't want to face that. And America hasn't faced it because it has been so horrific. But only when we face that can we truly leave it there and move on and create the America, the democracy that our forefathers wanted this country to be. So one of the things that I would recommend is that, if you have not already, is that you immerse yourself in Pulitzer Prize winner, New York Times Magazine reporter, Nicole Hannah-Jones, her project 1619 and her podcast in particular, because you hear the waves and you can only imagine the slaves coming off those ships. And you have a real understanding of what our history is like. As you know, we are in crisis today. I call this a crisis of two pandemics. We have COVID-19 and COVID-16-19. The year the first slave was brought to America. We're dealing with the remnants of both. And we really must work on those in order to get to the other side. So this case study has been a really valuable lesson for us. It teaches us our history. It teaches us not only African American history, but it teaches us American history. We are American history. The 10 components of the case study include slavery, which we talked about, segregation, civil rights, the civil rights movement, which opened the doors for so many, housing policy, and the impact that has had on us, the criminal justice system, which is really new slavery, as many have indicated, education, voting rights, and politics. And I must say, if you have not yet voted, you still have time to do so. Early vote before November 13th. And as they have been saying, if you have a mail-in ballot, don't mail it in, put it in a ballot box, because you can only imagine how many people fought and died for each and every one of us, no matter what race, creed, or color. People fought and died so we could have that vote. So don't give it up. And this is the most important election of our lifetime. The case study also focuses on healthcare, the media, and how it has such an influence over us, and all of the implications of this history. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, I was really taken by The Beat last night and Ari Melber. He had on filmmaker Ava DuVernay. And I loved what she said. It's similar to what the dean said. She indicated, you know, it's important that all of us learn during this time. Yes, we're here to listen and learn. But she also said, but what are you going to do about it? And that is our model of listen, learn, and then enact change. And she talked about the fact that she met so many individuals who now were so sensitized and so appreciative that they have learned history that they have never known, and learned about everyday events that they never knew about. But she also said, now that you're woke, what are you going to do about it? And that's the state that we are in. Each of us, no matter who we are, where we are, has the opportunity to enact change. What are we going to do about it? And so continue to think about that as inclusive leaders, as leaders of the future. How are you operating differently? Because you now do know. That is what's most important. So what do we know? After being immersed in this case study, we know the huge impact of slavery. We know that it is slavery that made America the richest country in the world. 400 years of free labor enabled us to be the richest country in the world. And when they decided, when the North said no, no more slavery, the South was opposed to that, because at that time, 75% of the world's cotton was being produced in the South. That was their economy. And so they didn't want to give that up. That's understandable. And so they fought. They fought for life the way they knew it. And it didn't matter that we were talking about enslaved individuals, enslaved human beings. But at the end of the day, the Civil War enabled slaves to be free. And that's a word, and that's the 13th Amendment. But are we really free? It's a conversation that the dean was having with all of us just a few minutes before we began our forum. You know, are we really free? After the Civil War, we became sharecroppers and beholding to those white plantation owners who owned us. And I frequently say that history just really repeats itself. So when you think about the Civil War, that's really tantamount, that's equal to our civil rights movement, that disruption and change. And out of the Civil War, you had congressmen, Black congressmen being elected. Out of the civil rights movement, you had senators and you had a Black president being elected. But out of Reconstruction grew the Ku Klux Klan. And out of our civil rights movement and our pinnacle and the election of Barack Obama grew an ugly period of our history. And so we always have in our history the pendulum shifting. And that's what's happening now. The worst of us is coming out. And I truly believe America does not like what it sees, that this is not who America is. This is not who America chooses to be. And so while history is repeating itself, out of Reconstruction, eventually you had the women's vote. And so you did have things move. We had our civil rights movement, and I think about history repeating itself. And I think about the 50s and Emmett Till and how this 14-year-old from Chicago was summering in Mississippi and was said to have whistled at a white woman. And days later, they found his ravaged body. And his mother courageously in Chicago at the funeral said, "Let them keep the casket open. They have to see what they did to my son." And he is frequently credited with being the start of the civil rights movement, with Rosa Parks occurring the year after. And so I wonder if Emmett Till and George Floyd are our sparks, because we do have sparks. And while we have sparks and have incredible leaders, whether it be Dr. King or Malcolm X or Fred Hampton, today we have young people. Today we have Blacks, brown people, white people, who all are saying enough is enough. And there is not just one leader in our movement. There are several leaders, as it should be. But they all are fighting for a better America. And one of the things that is most important is to understand and acknowledge our history, as I said before, so that we don't repeat our history. Let's acknowledge it and make sure that we don't create policies that really are reproducing that history in just another form. So, in terms of housing, one of our most ugliest moments in our history was when Black veterans came back from World War II, fighting for our country. And they were not allowed to have mortgages from the GI Bill in these wonderful new housing areas that were cropping up all throughout the suburbs because of the color of our skin. So we could go off and fight for our country, but we couldn't live anywhere, just anywhere in our country. So segregation and slavery still exist. And Michelle Alexander, the author Michelle Alexander, will tell you that slavery still exists in the prison system, as she talks about the new Jim Crow in her book. When you think about our population, Blacks represent 13% of the population in this country, but yet 40% of the prison population. That's the new slavery. And so we need to reform the criminal justice system and just not throw people away or privatize prisons. We need to really reform that system. In terms of education, we need to ensure that there is still freedom for all and that we're all equally educated. In Boston, you know that there was an incredible period in the 70s when individuals just fought because of busing, and they did not want kids, white kids bused and Black kids bused to be integrated. And from that, there was white flight, resulting now in 90% of the Boston public school system are kids of color. So we need to do better. We need to do better. And I don't need to tell you about our healthcare system. It's said that during slave times, we received minimal health care. And today in our communities of color, we receive minimal care as well. If you live in Roxbury, your life expectancy is 59 years. But you take the orange line, just 3 stops to Back Bay, and your lifespan is 92 years. What is wrong with that? Just 3 stops on the orange line, and your life can go from 59 years to 92 years. And let's not forget the impact of media and how all of the images we might see reflect white is right and black is wrong. And it's so wonderful today to see women, as a Black woman, it's wonderful to see so many Black women embrace their Blackness by all of the different colors of their hair, by all of the different hairstyles, the natural hairstyles, instead of having to try to look like we are white. So, 160 years ago, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. I would not have had these opportunities. I would be serving you. And I would be your slave. But that's not who we are. And all of us have to work to ensure that the impact of that time is truly erased and the remnants are not carried forward. And one way you can look at progress is by measuring it. And a way that you can measure our progress is by the wealth gap. The average wealth in Boston of a white family is $250,000. And the average wealth of a Black person is $8. Until we close that gap, we are still enslaved, no matter what people tell you. So let us work together and erase biases, particularly those unconscious biases, to ensure we truly have equality for all. And I know that Boston College is the perfect place to start. So it's always a pleasure being here. And we'd love to hear from you now, to hear your reactions to the case study. So we're going to ask Dewin Hernandez, MBA, MSW, class of 2021, to join us.
Thank you, Carol. And thank you for sharing some of your story and that great overview of our history. It's really important. And we do have a question from Warren, who wanted to know, having baby boomer parents who just never really were asked to acknowledge the full, true history of the United States, take offense to the notion that they got it wrong, so to speak. So how might you recommend we turn their animosity into empathy and understanding with regards to older generations that don't want to learn these vital and terrible truths in our history?
I think that is a good question, and it's a real question. And frequently, what's helpful is to look at other societies and how they have managed it. So you can look at South Africa, and you can look how they have managed their atrocities, where individuals shared, this is what I did. This is how I acted. I didn't think I was doing anything wrong, but yes, this is what I did. If you said that you were in this area and I hit you with a club, that is probably true. So for us to be able to have individuals of that era in America who can step forward and say, you know, I did not realize when I was selling you this house and steering you to this area only, that I was discriminating. But I realize I was now. I didn't realize then, but I realize it now. So I think it's helpful to have individuals who are like Warren's parents, of Warren's parents' era, saying, this is what I did. I didn't realize at that time, but as I reflect and as I understand now, that in fact was discriminating. And I would not do that now. I did not know then as much as America did not know, and I would not do it now. So it's helpful when we acknowledge, and it's fine to acknowledge that we didn't realize. And it's just someone like me acknowledging they did something wrong. And that kind of sits with you and makes you think that our mores and the way that our society operates can train us in a particular way that causes us to operate against a particular group of people.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question, Warren. And at this time, we received another question from Natalie, who wants to know, how do we move past acknowledging our own unconscious bias into reversing or changing it, or unlearning and relearning?
Mm-hmm. I think, similarly to, what I've done, I think all of us need to understand that we are all biased. We're human. That, in our minds, we form opinions. We are a product of our environment. And if you are in one particular environment that looks at the world one way, that's the way you think. And so we need to acknowledge that we come to life with biases. So it is important for us to constantly be checking our biases. So I can give you an example. I'm biased. I love being a woman, and I really like being around women. When I first came to the partnership to run that organization, I walked in and there were all women there. Now, personally, my heart was comfortable. I was really comfortable in that environment because of my personal preference for women. But I knew that my organization was missing something because we didn't have men. We were missing an entire gender. And so my organization would be better if we were more diverse. So I had to check my biases at the door, check those personal preferences at the door, and say, you know, the organization would be better if we were diverse in terms of women and men. And so my first few hires were men, and the organization was better. And so while I love being a woman, I love being a better CEO too.
Great, thank you. And I actually have a follow-up question that relates to that around how do we mitigate that bias and distribute power more equitably, which I think you alluded to in your response, right? Around checking our biases, which I really appreciate.
I think that we need also to acknowledge, I learned this during the Obama campaign, because there was a shift. We need to acknowledge that people don't like giving up their power.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter who you are. People don't like giving up their power. And so we need to understand that as an individual, that that's not comfortable for us. But if we are truly inclusive leaders, we have to give up power to be more powerful. The most powerful leaders are more confident in themselves and give up the power to the next generation, to others of difference, so that they can flourish. And you get your power from enabling other people. And so one of the things you can do is shift the power, that I still have power, but my power is enabling others. And so it's not always about just you. It's about helping others.
I love that. I love that. And I know that in social work, we talk about how do we empower others. And that's part of the way that we do it, is by giving up some of that power, because power is given, it isn't taken.
Yes, good point. Yes.
So we have Frank, who asked the great question: how does the racial wealth gap in the U.S. compare with other peer nations?
It's worse here. It's worse here. We have more people of color, and it stems from slavery and coming out of slavery with nothing. So that's our basis. So we have to go back to that. But I think that's a great question. And these housing policies and the job policies, they only exacerbate the fact that we've not been able to create wealth. And whatever wealth African Americans have been able to create, they came out of the civil rights movement, and they were badly impacted in the recession. So if you had a home, chances are you had one of those subprime mortgages. More people of color had one of those mortgages and were impacted by that. And what also happened is, even if you may not have been affected, everybody has a family member who was affected and is helping their family member. So while others have had the opportunity to accumulate wealth, that wealth is accumulated over generations, we have not had that opportunity, and our wealth is new. Our wealth is new. And in the recession, it was just taken away. And what do you think is going to happen in COVID-19? That's what's really scary. What financial impact will it leave Black and brown people come COVID-19 when we look back?
Yeah, and I want to add, it's centuries of structural economic racism, right? And I know that recently I came across an article that kind of spoke to this question as well. So an analysis,
Yes.
McKinsey and Company said that closing the racial wealth gap would add between $1 to $1.5 trillion in economic activity over the next 10 years through job creation and income gains. And I think we should be striving for that.
Yeah, and McKinsey's been really great at this work. And so I'm really impressed by them really leaning in to this work. And they really look at it from a business perspective, which is how you want folks to look at it.
For sure. And we have another question coming in through the Q&A. Thank you all so much for participating and engaging in this very important conversation. So we have an anonymous attendee who wants to know, what are some examples of ways corporations can lead in connecting local communities, government, and businesses to partner towards more equitable and inclusive business practices? So private-public partnerships, how might we be able to increase equity in that way?
Well, I'm biased. Warren will tell you I'm biased because I'm on the board of Eastern Bank, and I'm very proud of the work that we do there and have a special fund where we focus on helping Black and brown businesses scale. It's not about a handout. It is about how do you scale your business so that you can impact your community, you can hire more people, and that you are impacting generations. So I would hope that this model would be an example for many other businesses. Because at the end of the day, you cannot operate in a community unless, you cannot operate well in a community unless your community is doing well, unless your city is doing well. You won't be able to attract the kind of talent you want to attract, and you just need to ensure your community is doing well. Boston is 56% people of color. So are we partnering as businesses with the mayor, with our communities of color to ensure they are as healthy as possible?
I hope that answers the question. I also wanted to ask, Carroll, what is your opinion or your perspective on narrative? I know you mentioned media representation. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on narrative and some of the myths that come out of certain narratives that are told of Black people as a collective, and how racism might end a lot of the economic challenges that Black and brown communities have experienced, right? So there's a white supremacist myth that claims that brutal conditions in Black communities, right, are mainly the result of Black people's collective choices and moral failings, right?
You sound like Jared Kushner.
No, but I'm wondering, I know, and Andre Perry says that there's nothing wrong with Black people that ending racism can't solve, right? And so I'm curious, as an economic question, how might we debunk some of these narratives, dominant narratives, that really proliferates and perpetuates in our unconscious biases of certain groups of people and stereotypes?
So that impact us personally, that we believe ourselves, or that others believe about us?
That we internalize, right?
That we internalize,
right.
Okay. So one of the things I think is helpful for us to look at and to understand, just as I said to you, and I wanted to start the conversation so that everyone understood our history. I think it's really important for us to understand that we survived slavery. And so we are physically fit, we are mentally fit, we are the best because we didn't die. Our heritage survived it. And so we come from really strong people who survived the worst conditions. That's who we are. And so don't let anyone tell you you can't, number one. Number two, we have as an example of someone who is African and American who has had the opportunity and took it and was smart, is smart, and leveraged and became president of this challenging country. So don't let anybody tell you you can't. Everything is possible, including Kim Budd being named Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. Don't let anybody tell you you can't. They're saying we can't vote, and you see the lines. But we come from an incredible, invincible people. That's who we are. And for those individuals who came to our shores, who are immigrants, they understand where they have come from and the opportunity they have here and the potential. And they're not giving that up. So don't let anybody tell you differently. Just won't let it happen. Because they want to put you down because they want to win. And we are not going to let that happen.
Thank you, Carroll. We have time for one more question before we go into the next segment. And so we have Warren, another question from Warren. Are there consumer behaviors we can take as individuals to help close the wealth gap?
Well, I think that we can take a look at our organizations and look at who we're buying with, who are our diverse vendors. What percentage of our buying is with diverse vendors? And you don't have to be a large corporation to do that. But are you buying from diverse vendors? Or are you just, buying from, individuals that you know? Are you taking that step now that you're woke? Are you doing something about it and empowering individuals with businesses to be able to move their businesses? So that's one thing. As consumers, you can buy products and you can use services that are produced and owned and provided by diverse vendors. I think that's very important. You can support diverse businesses. That's very important because prior to COVID, the businesses that were the highest growing businesses were women of color. And so hopefully we'll get back to that as well with everybody participating.
Thanks again, Carroll. I know that for me, just reading this article really just showed me how deep, like, the level of exploitation and just the politics of it all, right? And so how a lot of this manifests in how legislation is passed and policies drafted. And so I want to kick it back to you with the next segment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it's always a pleasure talking with you. So we talked about our history, which is just so prevalent, and it's just so blatant, and it's out there. But what about the subtle, the unconscious biases that exist, that stall us, that prevent us? And for me, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg said it best. So let's hear from her, even though she is not with us. I love this quote from Justice Ginsburg. I think unconscious bias is one of the most difficult things to get at. And I actually have it as a part of my signature. So as you, as inclusive leaders, in your signature block, think about what quote, what statement you want to have that reflects who you are as you write your messages out to individuals. So it can reinforce, I'm an inclusive leader, and this is what's important to me. I think it's always helpful. But I love this because I think about all the ways Ruth Bader Ginsburg has impacted us and all the work that she has done. And here she is with her wisdom, telling us how prevalent unconscious bias is. And so she's telling us how important it is for us to work at. And this is hard stuff, which means we have to work at it even more. So I wanted to be sure to share that with you. I think unconscious bias is one of the most difficult things to get at. So let's explore unconscious bias, and let's explore the definition. So unconscious bias are stereotypes about groups of people that individuals form outside their own conscious bias. As I had said before, we all hold unconscious beliefs about various groups. And these biases stem from the worlds that we come from. Unconscious bias is far more prevalent than conscious bias because we know when we're doing something wrong and we'll stop ourselves typically. But unconsciously, we just operate. And frequently that unconscious bias, we're operating and we don't have the time to check ourselves. And then certain scenarios can activate unconscious attitudes and beliefs. So for example, biases may be more prevalent when you're multitasking or working under time pressure. So you're under time pressure, you're working hard. So your unconscious bias might come out because you don't have time to think or check or be careful. And so something automatic might come out that you typically might not do. So that's why it's always important to be thinking about who you are, but more importantly, who you want to be. Because we have these unconscious biases that are just within us. For me, I can tell you that I am a composite of many people. I constantly watch people and watch how they operate. Wayne Budd, who is a BC alum, and my former boss when I worked at John Hancock, is one of the individuals who I admire and I look at and try to mirror. And I look at how he shares power. And so while I, going up in the world, may not have been as secure as him, I watched how he gave out power. And so I learned to give out power because I had him as a model, as opposed to keep power myself. And so I learned not to be so biased about individuals, and learned to be more giving because I had a role model that I wanted to be like. And so I ask people to think about who they want to be as opposed to who they are, so that we can continually model behavior as we continually grow. And we never stop growing. Inclusive leaders never stop growing. So I just want to share with you my perspective of unconscious bias. And Marilyn and I had a chance to talk about this. In the first presidential debate, they shared the topics in advance. And one of the topics was titled Race and Violence in American Cities. And I was taken aback by that. Now, this is the Presidential Commission on Debates. What prompted them to equate race and violence? I was really taken aback. And so I felt that was biased. And the second presidential debate, they must have gotten a lot of flack from that, because the second presidential debate, the topic was race in America. And there's a difference. Because if you have the topic race in America, you still have an opportunity to talk about violence in cities, whatever. But why equate race and violence in cities? That's saying if you're of color, you're violent. And I felt that was unconscious bias. I didn't feel it was conscious. I felt it was unconscious. And those are messages that we're giving out to all of America and around the world about people of color. And that's why unconscious bias is so powerful. And Marilyn and I had a great conversation about that. And I just urge everyone that when you come across issues like this, that you discuss it with your colleagues. I noticed Joy Reid, anchor Joy Reid, was taken aback by this as well. But when you come up against unconscious bias, by all means, address it with your colleagues and point it out, because not everyone will see it. And you want to know as well. So when someone realizes you've done something that has been unconscious, my goodness, you want to know about it too. So encourage your colleagues and your friends to advise you about anything that you've done that might be unconscious, because at the end of the day, none of us on this Zoom webinar, none of us want to be racist or none of us want to be exclusionary. All of us, as a woman of color, I've been in meetings where I've said, I've made a comment, big meetings where I've made a comment, a board meeting, I've made a comment, and it was not taken up. No one said anything. 10 minutes later, a white male makes the same comment, and everybody thinks it's a great idea. So what do? Now that's unconscious bias, because when Carroll says it, it's like, oh, okay. But when Joe says it, because of the power Joe might wield, oh, it's a good idea. So what you have to do is indicate diplomatically, always diplomatically, oh, I'm so glad everyone likes, or I'm so glad there's support for this idea. I had mentioned it a few minutes ago, and so glad everyone feels this is a good way to go. Now, what I have found is when that happens and you're a bystander in the boardroom and you see it happen to someone else, it is your responsibility to speak up on that person's behalf. So when you, no matter who you are, see it happen, you can say, oh, that's great. Sharon mentioned that a few minutes ago. I'm so glad everyone thinks it's a good idea. That's so much better than Sharon having to mention it. That is moving from being a bystander to an upstander. And so I encourage, whenever you see something that can be changed, be an inclusive leader and be the diplomat and share your power of inclusive leadership with others, because you're teaching others as well. So I wanted to make sure to share that. I also wanted to share the work of my good friend, Dr. Robert Livingston of the Kennedy School. He is an incredible expert on diversity. And he has done so much research on power and perception of power. He has done research and indicated that 60% of CEOs are over 6 feet tall. His thesis, his rationale is that people perceive power as being tall, white, and I'll share this and get into it in a minute, and having an angular face. Now, 60% of CEOs are over 6 feet tall, yet only white males over 6 feet tall, yet only 15% of the population, 15% of the male population is 6 feet tall. So there's a perception that power comes if you're tall. That if you're tall, that means you're powerful. If you're short, you're not perceived as powerful, unless you're Jack Welch. I also think that there's an opportunity to look a little deeper into his work, and it's called the teddy bear effect. And he talks about the fact that the perception of power is white, male, over 6 feet tall, with angular faces, with an angular face. And the angular face represents power as opposed to a chubby face. But with African Americans, with Blacks, the teddy bear effect comes into play, where if you're Black, you have to have a chubby face to indicate some softness. And so he even says he's talked to CEOs, Black CEOs, who say that they wear glasses so that they look more nerdy and not angry. So again, these are perceptions. These are these unconscious biases that are at play. And so we want to be aware of them and we want to acknowledge them. So really interesting work. So please look up Dr. Robert Livingston. So when we think about unconscious bias, acknowledge that we all have them. It's who we are. Think about who we want to be and not who we are, and operate on who we want to be. As inclusive leaders, check our biases at the door. Do everything we can to check our biases at the door. That's leadership. And move from a bystander to an upstander. And know that that's how you want to be treated. If anyone should do anything to you, you'd want someone to say, hey, you know what? Let me tell you what Fred or Mary did. So that's most appreciated. So that's a little bit about unconscious bias and what we can do as individuals. And I'm happy to take questions.
All right, so let's just dive right in. I know, Carroll, that you mentioned just around unconscious bias, and I really appreciate you bringing up the teddy bear effect. And I think it's so interesting, right? Especially how we internalize in terms of how the messaging, right? And how we internalize just in terms of representation. That's why representation matters, right? Around who has power and who does not, who's intimidating, who is not. And we had a question that wanted to know how do we advocate and kind of invite people in who a friend of similar age to look at the history, the social and economic systems of oppression of people of color, especially when there's so much misinformation that's being perpetuated by the media and drawing false narratives. So if you have any thoughts on that, on how we might be able to influence and persuade our colleagues, our peers.
I think the best way is through media. I think whether it be readings, podcasts, videos, short interviews, I think are very impactful because this is tough subject matter. And I think to be able to watch something together with someone, or to do a reading together with someone and then to discuss it, that's really important, to have that opportunity to talk together with someone. So if you want to share information, if you want to share Dr. Kendi's work on anti-racism, who focuses on the fact, it's not enough to be not racist. We want everyone to be anti-racist. What are you doing to make change? It really helps people to think, but it's also helpful to talk it through. Remember, our model is to listen, learn, and enact change. And when we enact change, what we also want to do is build community so that we can talk and engage together.
Thank you, Carol. And, you know, a thought that came up for me as you were, you know, discussing unconscious bias is that of microaggressions. For me, I've worked under leadership that would constantly make racial statements based on stereotypes and microaggressions that harmed staff, that harmed me, but the experience taught me as well what kind of leadership I was willing to work under, what type of leader I wanted to be, and what to look for in a company I wanted to work for going forward. So how do we deal with that? How do we work through microaggressions? And what are your thoughts on that?
I think that it's important for people to know that they are exhibiting behavior, because when someone, when they give a microaggression, they may not be aware. So I think, again, it's back to diplomacy. I had a young colleague who actually was in tears. She told me one of her colleagues at work said to her, and they thought they were delivering a compliment. She's Haitian, this young woman who I was talking with. And she said that the colleague said, "Oh, you talk so well for an immigrant." And the young Haitian woman was in tears with me because, first of all, the colleague who said that to her thought she was giving a compliment. And in actuality, there was unconscious bias there, because we have to ask, would she have said that if the person was French? And so I think we have to help train people. So if you come up with a situation like that, I think it's okay to be honest. So you can go back to that individual the next day. Always take time. I don't think the best thing is to deliver comments in the moment, because I don't think we think about the best way to approach it. But I think it's worth thinking about and then having a short conversation with someone. And so the next day, one could say, you know, "Mary, I know that you really meant well by telling me that, you know, I was so well-spoken, that I was so well-spoken for an immigrant. But I want you to put yourself in my shoes. Think how I might have felt thinking that, would you have said that if I were white, if I were French?" And you don't even have to say white. You can say, "if I were French." So that you're taking the onus off of the person, you're putting it on yourself, but you're making that person think. And you just say, think about that. And I just want to tell you how it made me feel, because I know that wasn't your intent. But what you said made me feel this way. So I feel it's important to share that with you. Now, if the person's intent was to make her feel bad, then she accomplished what she wanted to. But if the person's intent was not to make her feel bad, she could think about her unconscious bias. And we have to talk about it. We have to talk about how people's words make one feel.
Agreed. And on that note, Carol, we have an attendee that stated very powerfully that, you know, this new awareness comes, you know, great responsibility, and there's an opportunity for centers, student groups, faculty within CSOM to really check these unconscious biases and be more intentional and deliberate about bringing in speakers who are more diverse and not primarily white and men. And this was a comment made by one of our attendees, so thank you. And so with that, thank you so much for having me. I want to kick it back to you, Carol, for some final thoughts.
Well, thank you. It's always, again, a pleasure to be here. And we have some important work to do within these next few days. November 3rd is important for all of us. And as I said before, if you have not yet early voted, please make sure you do so. If you have a mail-in ballot, don't mail it in, as you know, put it in the ballot box. But most importantly, vote. This is the most important election of our lifetime. This election is about you and your future. And I just want to make sure that your future is bright and that we can be a part of it and do whatever we can to help you succeed, because all of you are inclusive leaders, and I'm just really fortunate to be a part of your community. So thank you for having me, and I'm happy to turn it over to my new good friend, Dean Eckelman.
Thank you, Carol. As always, very provocative and gives us lots to think about. Just a summary of what I think we heard today is we can't solve our problems without acknowledging our history. There is no future without acknowledging our history. I know when I read the article, I was just stunned at how little I knew, how ill-informed I was. Also today, to make sure that we're not creating policies that are just recreating our past history, and that in different forms, using different media. And as truly inclusive leaders, we need to give some of our power away. You know, we're only as powerful as much as we empower others. I thought the comment by the last participant who submitted the anonymous quote was, "With awareness comes responsibility." That was great. And as always, Carol, we continue to follow the model of listen, learn, and enact change. So it's our pleasure to host you today. And we look forward to our next forum, which we'll be sending out an announcement about that, which will be after the election. And we look for a really lively discussion of what now and where are we going. So thank you all for participating. Have a good evening, and we'll see you next month.